All right, we're going to continue the Life Principles Daily Bible. As you can probably tell from my voice, I am still a bit sick. So I'm going to give it my best shot today. But although I sound worse than yesterday, I actually do feel a little bit better than yesterday. I knew this would come up. If you're doing the daily Bible, that's going to be Bible every day for an entire year and pretty much guaranteed to get sick at some point. So I guess I'm being tested with this sooner rather than later. But I'm glad I still did the Bible reading today because there's some very good ones. We have Joseph's dreams, Joseph sold by his brothers, two very famous stories there. And then in the New Testament, Jesus starts to get into some of his parables. And I learned something new about why he used parables, which we'll get into in a moment. So first we'll start off with Genesis 37, Joseph's dreams. And I think a good place to start would be, now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. Remember, Joseph was born of Rachel. She had been barren for quite a long time. There was the almost baby battle, we could call it that, between Leah and Rachel, where Leah was having a bunch of children, and Leah's servants were having a bunch of children, all with Jacob, who became Israel. And then Rachel finally gave birth to Joseph at a fairly old age. And then she gave birth to Benjamin, who is Israel's last son. And then Rachel died in childbirth at that point. So right off the bat, it says Israel liked Joseph more than any of his other sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. Now, I've heard different things about this robe of many colors. I've also heard that it could be interpreted as like a long sleeve robe. What makes it significant is to give a gift like this, it seems to be, one, showing him that he's the favorite, but might even be showing that he is the heir, which would normally be the firstborn son, but Joseph is so much the favorite of Israel that this coat could signify that the possessions or whatever, the birthright would pass to him. But when the brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. So the brothers are basically jealous of Joseph. Now, you'd think Joseph could maybe do some things to get back on his brother's good side, but the next two stories are the exact opposite. He's almost just rubbing salt in the wound. And, you could say he's just speaking the truth, but maybe not very intelligently. He almost reminds me of Dostoevsky's book, The Idiot, where he just says things because it's true, and he's maybe not seeing how people might interpret it poorly based on where their heart is, but gets interpreted poorly nonetheless. So now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." So his brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. And then he basically has another dream about the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. So that 11 stars points to his 11 brothers all bowing down to him. So he's not the firstborn of the brothers, but his father likes him the most. And then he has two dreams that say that his brothers are going to bow down to him. And this one, even Israel has a little bit of a problem with. But it does seem that Israel kind of thinks about it, whereas the brothers, it just makes them dislike him even more. So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. So then at this point, I'll just summarize this next one. Israel sends Joseph out to his brothers who are shepherding the flock. And when they see Joseph coming, they decide that they want to kill him because they're jealous. But luckily, Reuben seems to be decent, and he says, you know what? Instead of killing him, let's just throw him in a pit so we don't have blood on our hands. And then Reuben has the plan that he'll just come back and rescue Joseph later. Then Judah has a different plan. They see some traders coming, and Judah says, why don't we just sell them into slavery? So we don't waste, we might as well make a little profit from this. So they sell them into slavery. And what they do is they take that nice coat and they dip it in, they kill I believe it's a goat, and then they dip his coat in that blood. So then Israel thinks that Joseph got torn apart by wild animals. And I believe that's pretty much the summary of the rest of Genesis 37. And then, meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. So Joseph at this point has been sold into slavery in Egypt under an officer of the Pharaoh named Potiphar. And then the next chapter, not going to go into too much detail here just because I don't really know the lesson we're supposed to learn from this one, but it's Judah and Tamar. Maybe this story is thrown in here just to emphasize that Judah is not a very good guy. In this, he basically sleeps with someone, has a bunch of children, and then he ends up sleeping with his daughter-in-law, and the story gets a bit complicated from there. So I'm not going to dive into that one too much. I want to save time and my voice to be able to go through Jesus's parable. So, and I think maybe just the thing to draw from that Judah story is just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean God's condoning it or approving it. Sometimes things are in the Bible to show things that God does not approve of. So now let's get into Psalm 9, 11 through 20. And I think I'll just read the very end of this. So verses 19 and 20. Arise, O Lord, do not let man prevail. Let the nations be judged in your sight. Put them in fear, O Lord, that the nations may know themselves to be but men. So how I interpret that based on first reading, or I guess second reading, I read it earlier, is David, who's most likely writing this psalm, is saying, Lord, don't let man prevail. Let the nations be judged by your sight. So he maybe sees the corruption of the nations, corruption of man. And he says, God, don't let them get away with this. Put them in fear, O Lord, that the nations may know themselves to be but men. So perhaps he's talking about nations or men who think of themselves as God. They've gotten perhaps prideful. And he's saying, God, put them in their place, please. And then Proverbs 3, 31 through 35. It's pretty short, so I'll just read it. Do not envy the oppressor, and choose none of his ways. For the perverse person is an abomination to the Lord, but his secret counsel is with the upright. The curse of the Lord is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the home of the just. Surely he scorns the scornful, but gives grace to the humble. The wise shall inherit glory, but shame shall be the legacy of fools. I think my favorite line of that is, but gives grace to the humble. I think somebody quotes that in the New Testament. Perhaps it's James or Paul. Somebody says grace to the humble. I've definitely read that somewhere else. But I like that. God gives grace to the humble. If you're in that self-righteous position, like the Pharisees that we've been reading about in the New Testament, Jesus says, you know what? You guys are even further away. And it isn't just the Pharisees who are self-righteous, but perhaps our own pride based on our own ideas of like what makes us good and what makes us worthy can actually be things that pull us back from God. So maybe you're very successful in your career and perhaps you think that makes you better than other people. But here it says, but God gives grace to the humble. So perhaps some of those things that we deem as good in this world can actually be the same things that hold us back from God. Now, that doesn't mean, okay, be unsuccessful in your career, but your work should be for the glory of God. Now, easier said than done. I feel like just this last week I was starting to try to get very ambitious again. And I was maybe telling myself, okay, I'm doing this for God. But the fact that I burnt out and got sick because of it shows that maybe my motivations weren't all that good. And perhaps I was acting out of pride, out of trying to earn God's approval, even though that can't be done. And I was focusing on all these works first and foremost, as opposed to focusing on the heart and letting the works just flow from that. So that's something I'm going to be working on as I move forward. So now let's get into the New Testament. We've got Matthew 13. So we have the parable of the sower. So the same day Jesus went out of the house, he just healed someone who I believe had a demon, was blind, was mute, and was deaf. And seems that he did that in the house because now he's coming out of the house. And he sat beside the sea. And great crowds gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and sat down. So there's lots of people on the shore. He's in a boat and he's starting to preach. And the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, a sower went to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears, let him hear. So then the disciples ask him, I don't need to interpret this right off the bat because Jesus actually interprets it for us, and it's better to hear Jesus's interpretation than mine. So I'll just go on here where the disciples ask him, why do you speak in parables? And he answered, to you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. So that is a pretty strong case right there for, I believe it's called divine election, that God predestines who's going to come to him even before we're born. And since we're of the flesh before we're saved, the flesh can profit nothing, and the flesh can't believe in God. The flesh can't want to follow Jesus. But it's God who has to take that heart of stone and turn it into, a little confusing, but it's called a heart of flesh in Ezekiel 36. And once that regeneration happens, once your heart is changed, then you have the ability to understand the word of God. And this is what this parable seems to be explaining. But that key part there is, to you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven. So being able to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven is something that's given to us. It's not something we earn or something we deserve. And then, pretty hardcore verse after this, he says, for the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. So he seems to be speaking in parables. How did R.C. Sproul put it? He says, to reveal and conceal. So for the people who have that regenerate heart, when he speaks in parables, they can understand it. But for everybody else who still has a heart of stone, they don't understand it. And I think it was what I was reading in the MacArthur Study Bible, which is actually this, what we're reading. He said that he conceals it from the people who aren't part of God's predestined elect, or whatever you call them, because the more he were to tell them, the more they would be condemned, because the more evidence they would have had for why they should choose God, but then they still wouldn't. So by concealing what he's speaking to them, it actually could be viewed as a form of mercy, because he's reducing their condemnation by purposely speaking in a way that he knows they can't understand. But then for the people who are saved, they're still able to get the message through to them. It's almost like a secret language that you could be speaking to the same group. Some people get it, some people don't. And the people who get it, it's because God gave them the ability to understand. So one thing that's really confusing to me there, and is something that I'm going to look into going forward, is how could somebody come to faith by proclaiming, okay, I surrender my life to Jesus. I believe Jesus lived, died, and was resurrected. It seems like they can't speak that out because they don't have an ability to understand that. It seems that what has to happen first is the regeneration. And then R.C. Sproul says that the faith instantly happens in that moment. But regeneration precedes faith. Because when we're in the flesh, we can't have faith, because when we're in the flesh, we don't want to be with God. We don't want to surrender to God. And it makes sense to me that regeneration precedes faith. But it's because that's exactly how my personal experience was. But it then seems weird that some people would argue that in order to be saved, you have to say, oh, I believe that Jesus lived, died, and was resurrected. Because let's say that regeneration happens in an instant. You're a person who is blind to the gospel. You can see, but without seeing. You can hear without hearing. And then God, I think R.C. Sproul calls it, quickens your heart. So he softens your heart in that moment. And then perhaps in that moment, you then believe in God. But it would then be surprising to me if you would then the next second say a claim like Jesus lived, died, and resurrected. That's a little bit confusing to me, but I'll look into that further. Yeah. So I didn't really interpret it before, but now let's see Jesus's own interpretation. So this is picking up in Matthew 13, verse 18. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. So there's the path. That's like where a lot of people have walked. So it's very hard ground. And then the seeds are dropped there. And what Jesus is saying is that's where people don't understand that the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. And then that's what was sown along the path. So hard heart, just the seed bounces right off of that path. The word just bounces right off your heart. The evil one snatches it away. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while. And when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away. So these days, there's maybe not as much persecution for believing in the word as there was back then. But God and Jesus also call us to a very difficult path. So I'd imagine those people who have shallow soil, it's above rocky ground. The seed maybe gets a little water in that top layer of soil, so then it sprouts up. But then the sun starts to beat on it, and because it doesn't have roots that can break through the rock, there's not enough water, so it withers away. He says that's like people who, when they face persecution, then they put away the word because they're not willing to, willing to die for it. That's basically what Jesus kind of calls his disciples to do. Since we don't see as much persecution these days, I would imagine that includes people who start to believe in the word and then they realize, oh, God calls us to do some pretty difficult things. And, that's against maybe my interests in this present moment, or things that I'd like to do, or things that society has told me is fine. And culture has conditioned me into it becoming a habit in my life. And I could either give up all of those things, or I could give up the word. And that's probably people who those seeds fall on the rocky ground. And then they immediately fall away. Then he says, as for what was sown among thorns, this is one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. Now, this one might be a little bit scarier because in the first two, it seems like the people fall away fairly quickly. Whereas this one, the seed actually grows up among the thorns. So this might be someone who actually can be kind of established and maybe reading the Bible, maybe going to church, but then it's the kind of sort of what I was saying for that last one as well, where it's the cares of this world or the deceitfulness of riches then become more important than the word. And that seed that was growing then just withers away and it dies. It chokes the word and it proves unfruitful. So interesting that it actually doesn't say the plant dies. It says it chokes the word and it proves unfruitful. So maybe that plant does grow up, but there's no fruit from it. So it seems like in all these cases, it's people who are not actually saved, because I believe it's James who says, faith without works is dead. And I believe it's R.C. Sproul who says, you're justified by faith alone, but not by a faith that is alone. So here it's saying the seed maybe takes root amongst the thorns and it grows up, but there's no fruit. And without the fruit, it shows that that faith isn't real. Again, faith precedes works. The works are supposed to stem from the faith. And it's not the works that lead to your salvation. Then, as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it. He indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. So this is someone who God has given the ability to understand the word. And the word takes root, it grows up, and interestingly, the fruit varies. So it seems like regeneration is just from God. But then how much fruit comes from that is more of a collaboration. So regeneration just from God. And then after that, we have, at that point, we're justified because we have true faith in that moment. Faith after regeneration. A lot of big words here. And then the rest of our life in this world is sanctification, where it's not just God, it's us working with God. Where I believe it's Paul who says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. So it's, you're being called to work, but it's God who works in you, which sounds like a paradox, but it is both of you in collaboration. And that is where I'd say some of our own effort can come in and our own discipline can come in, where the more you read the Bible, the more you sing worship music, the more time you spend at church, the more time you spend amongst fellow believers talking about the word, doing good works, that is where you actually do get more fruit from that effort. So it ties back to that idea that we get into heaven not based on our merit, but through faith alone, and is not a result of works so that no one may boast. It is the gift of God. But then there's numerous cases throughout the Bible that once we get in heaven, the degree of our rewards does depend on the works that we've done in this life. Where if you've done a little and you have a little fruit, maybe you're in that 30 fruit, then, heaven's still going to be awesome. You'd much rather be there than hell. But there's some people who fully commit themselves. And that's going to be someone who bears lots of fruit. They bear 100-fold. So then the question would be, who do you want to be? And you can put it into contrast to the other people, where you can value things of this world, you can value riches, you can value maybe your own safety, or you can value surrendering to God, doing everything you can for his glory because he saved you. And the only approval you really need is his. And luckily we have that approval because we're counted as righteous when we have faith in Jesus. Sounds like a very interesting way to put it, but maybe that's almost like one of those parables where people who don't believe in Jesus wouldn't understand that. And then people who do believe in Jesus, they'd be like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. So it's kind of interesting that Jesus talks in parables like this. And it seems to be how since I've been on both sides of this, I can actually understand it. Where for the first 28 years of my life, I went to church almost every Sunday with my parents, but none of it made any sense to me. I had a hard heart. I was like that pathway. I wasn't even like rocky ground. I was like the pathway where the seeds just bounced right off. And then that regeneration happened, that faith happened. And ever since then, the word just makes sense. I can read this and there's verses that stand out to me, that speak to me, that change me, that transform me. So I don't know how you would advise someone to lead that or to get there, because if it's God who gives them that, if it's God who grants them that ability to understand, it seems like it's a little bit out of our hands. But at the same time, maybe a big part of it is humility. We read in our proverb, God gives grace to the humble. And then perhaps trying to pray, saying, God, please take my heart of stone and turn it into a heart of flesh. And as we read in a lot of the Psalms, when you cry out to God, he often answers. But my voice is quite done and I'm quite tired. So I'm going to go to bed. Hopefully I won't be as sick tomorrow. Thanks for watching.